All right. Good afternoon. Yeah, you can talk back. It's okay. It's good. This is a fantastic crowd. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. This is the second in the series of Fuel the Fire series. How many of you were here for Carol? How many got to come? Fantastic. James, they are ready. James is in the back, but James is going to be speaking to us tonight, as you well know, and I actually got to spend some time with him, and he is fantastic. You're really going to enjoy hearing from him about how we take our community and excel it forward. But as we start tonight, we do want to thank our funding partners. Several of them are here in the crowd today. The Leadership Council, the Chamber of Commerce, the Knight Foundation, the Wichita Community Foundation, the Downtown Development Corporation, and then those two who have helped to make this space available. Isn't this a neat building and what they're doing with it? We're very fortunate that we have very creative developers in our city, and we have a local group that's working on this. I know that Dr. Eister and also Michael Ramsey with Boca Development, they're here, and we want to just thank them for making this available to us. It's fantastic just to see the transformation of this great iconic building in our downtown, of what it has been in the past, but what it is now serving as today and what we'll be doing going forward as well. Farha Construction and then also Kent Audiovisual, all helping to make tonight possible. So we appreciate all these individuals for making this evening possible. You know, just as we experienced with Carol Collide just a few weeks ago, we know that this evening is going to have exciting and thought-provoking presentation and also conversation. You know, at the first lecture, following the presentation, we had a great Q&A period. And again, we want to let you know that that will happen. When James concludes this evening, we'll have a couple of people running through the crowd with mics so that you can ask questions to James. And that's where we really, I think, have a great opportunity for conversation. You know, as we start this afternoon, we would like to welcome all our elected officials. I know coming in, I saw Janet Miller and Levanta Williams for the City Council. And it's hard to see when you're sitting up here looking out, but we do appreciate the council members being here this evening. On the County Commission, I know Commissioner Norton is here, and then I'm not for sure about the other commissioners, but again, Commissioner Norton, thank you for being here this evening as well. One of the things we want to make sure that you're aware of is that tonight there will be social media posts that are running on the screens to my left and to my right. If you want to use the hashtag, there we go, there, Fuel Fire ICT to be able to do that. And then also, be sure and follow Wichita CF, Downtown Wichita, and Venture Boldly on Facebook and Twitter, actually between the lecture series and also as we continue to go forward. This evening, when the partners got together and started, putting forth the thought of what we want to do with Fuel the Fire series, James was one of the individuals that quickly came to our mind that we had to have as one of the speakers. And so we're very fortunate that James is here with us tonight. You know, James has a passion for helping communities excel to the next level. Plus, Wichita is a place that James has called home. So he has a direct tie to our community. One of the things that Carol talked about in her lecture just a few short weeks ago was that communities need to capitalize on the loyalty of those who still have strong ties to their city, although they may no longer live in that location, and we have that in James. In fact, James is no stranger. He is here quite often speaking to the Wichita community. James is the president of Reach Advisors, a strategic research and predictive analytics firm. I bolded that in my notes. I love that. Predictive analytics firm. It's good to know that you know. And certainly as we move forward with downtown development, we want to make sure, and as a community, we want to make sure we know that we're doing is the right course of action. He assists clients with navigating shifts in their external landscape. His clients include some of North America's most innovative companies and organizations. Prior to launching Reach Advisors, James founded a targeted media and research firm that he eventually sold to a Fortune 200 company. James' work is featured regularly as a keynote presenter, and he also serves as a writer, analyst, and a recurring source of media organizations such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Times, and NPR. Before and after earning his MBA degrees, he worked for the multimedia company of Knight Ridder newspapers, including the Wichita Eagle. So he knows, again, our community very well. James earned his bachelor's and MBA from Harvard University after completing his early education at USD 259 and Wichita Collegiate School. We're excited to hear this evening what James has to say about national trends and how to competitively position Wichita for our future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to James Chung.
Well, it's good to see so many of you are involved in the town that you were at Carol Coletta's presentation a couple weeks back. I had the chance to look at the video from her presentation, and this concept of fractional loyalty was sort of interesting, about reaching out to the people who, have lived here, love the place, but might not live there anymore. And I kept hearing what she was saying, and I was thinking, this is such a cool idea. This is so great. Cities should do this. People would eat it up, until she got to the line of saying, and you should ask them for money, too. Just kidding. I actually do give money to a couple of organizations in Wichita, so it's actually not a bad idea. Anyway, like Jeff was saying, I run this really weird firm, Strategy, Research, and Predictive Analytics. It's a little bit wonky, but I love it. It's a lot of fun. And a lot of people ask me, how did you get there? How do you do that? And a lot of people say, was it your education? And I say, yes. But when I think about it, it really helped to think about where that all started. My parents moved here when I started kindergarten. And we moved into this modest house in a fantastic neighborhood that welcomed us with open arms. This neighborhood fed into a school, an elementary school, that also served a lot of Wichita's most underserved neighborhoods. So it was one of the lower socioeconomic schools in Wichita. Yet, I still got a great education from kindergarten through third grade, despite that fact. It was still a possibility. And thank you, Mrs. Baltz, for letting me run with those SRA readers as fast as I could. I'm also a product of the Wichita Public Library System. Fantastic resource, unquestionably helped put me on the trajectory that I'm on. Thanks for Mrs. Ellis for smiling every time I came with that big stack of books. Moving on, Coleman Junior High. I love that mushroom building. I was looking for photos of that. And it's another environment where this is probably best junior high school in America, or Coleman Middle School now. There was one teacher who ran his math class as if it were a National Guard operation, and everything in the world depended on how you did that day in class. You bet. Thank you, Jim Price. Because if it weren't for him, I probably would not be on the trajectory that I got on. He just pushed and pushed and pushed. It was a remarkable experience, probably the best classroom experience I've ever had in my life. I do a lot of these presentations all over the world. I don't choke up like this when I do that. I also grew up in a city that was I was fortunate to have access to a lot of educational resources. And when I realized that I was probably on a little bit different path, I was able to switch schools, Wichita Collegiate, another place that just had high standards and allowed me to really run, thank you, Dr. Coopersmith. Went off to college, went away. At first I was thinking, grew up in Wichita, Kansas. This is going to be really hard. I'm probably going to be, it's going to be really tough. And I realized once I got there, my education in Wichita made college really easy. It was a fantastic place. I came back to Wichita afterwards, and I got a different kind of education between college and business school. I caught up with a couple of guys that were doing these crazy things like, they were out there and they were like taking abandoned warehouse space and creating some really cool art and events out of those things. I remember the first show, the police would show up because there were hundreds and hundreds of all these youth clustering in an abandoned building, and they were stunned. Wait, they're gathering for art? So these guys go on, do some amazing things here, not just with the space, not with their own art, but in being a welcoming place for other artists, fostering that community, opening it up to those who weren't quite there and couldn't really understand art, making that all accessible. What I learned from that experience was the value of art. Not just, I did learn about art from these guys. I also learned about the value of art in building community and its role in tying and creating and shaping community. To this day, I serve some of the nation's best arts and cultural organizations, and what those guys have done down on Commerce Street tops anything I've seen anywhere in the country. It's a really remarkable place. Now what I want to do is take a look at how Wichita has changed since my time here. I realize I'm fortunate that I grew up in Wichita. And so, let's take a look at what's changed since then. So first off, let's take a look at population dynamics. We spend a lot of time doing a lot of economic demography, and let's pick apart a couple things. So since I last was in Wichita, early 1990s, a lot of things have changed. So for example, let's take a look at it through the lens of USD 259. Over the last 3 decades, that photo is from Curtis Junior High. If you take a look at the stats now, USD 259, it's 36% white, not Hispanic. It's 2/3 minority. It's a very different environment. I had a chance to look at some of their stats, and it was sort of stunning how much things have shifted so fast. Yet at the same time, the school district has done a remarkable job at still increasing graduation rates. The reason why that's a concern to me is I work with some of the nation's largest community development organizations, like 13,000 acres in California. I mean, massive things. Like for the organization that built Rancho Mission Viejo, one of the biggest, best, most successful suburban communities in America. And I look at that, and often when I take a look at what are the factors that influence their long-term health and growth, often one of the factors that comes up is the community's ability to improve educational attainment among the minority community, Hispanic community in particular. And what we found is that of communities that can do a good job at driving educational attainment among Hispanics to be able to serve in the community, serve in the workforce more effectively, go off to college, or whatever that point is, it's an economic bonanza for these large-scale developments, for these for community developments. It was so clear when we were modeling the numbers, they would be selling a whole lot more homes. They would have a workforce that employers would come to. It was just no question. The economic rewards and returns are fantastic. The flip side of that is we notice that for communities that cannot drive that kind of improvement, it's a problem. But it was good to see how USD 59, looking through numbers, was driving increases in graduation rates and is stabilizing and improving test scores, despite the fact that they're dealing with a very, very different environment than when I was there. So let's take, for example, data point 1980. In comparison, 76% white, not Hispanic. Now, we're data geeks. We pour through that stuff, but I realized I had even a better set of data, the 1980 yearbook. And guess what? It was exactly 3/4 white and not Hispanic. So it was right on the numbers, and this was an era when the families like this page, the Brasted family, the Chung family, the Cobb family, could all go to school and know they could count on a great education. And that's something I hope can still happen in Wichita today. Now let's take a look at population dynamics, the changing face of the population in Wichita. Through 3/4 of the last decade, it was more than 90% white, not Hispanic. So when the time that we arrived, and then the trigger of this is that what happened is in 1965, there was a 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that changed the composition of the people who could come to the U.S. And I didn't realize until I started doing this kind of work that that 1965 Act probably explains why I was born in Louisiana in 1966. So we have this change going on. Now, 25 years ago in Wichita, it was still pretty stable. Today, it's 75% white, non-Hispanic. But we also took a look at, that's for the Wichita metro area. We looked at the Wichita suburbs, and basically it looks like it did in 1970. It's a very different environment. The city of Wichita, the metro area, is changing so dramatically, but in ways that might not always be seen in day-to-day life. If we take a look at the city of Wichita, it's even more pronounced, very homogeneous, even 25 years ago, now 2/3. But the big point I want to make here is in Wichita, youth population is already majority minority. It's such a dramatic change, but you don't see it for 2 reasons. One is that I would guess that of this audience, 90% lives out in the suburbs, and think about the age as well, too. your cohort looks very different than the younger cohort. But that is part of the change going on in Wichita today, like in most major metro areas. There's another big change I want to flag, and that's the aging of Wichita. It's happening across the country, but let's look at the impacts on Wichita. If you look at the 65-year-old plus population, in this decade alone, we're seeing a 33% increase, 34% increase in the audience at 65 and older. It's a very significant shift. It's a generation that's changed everything in their wake, and they're changing aging as well, too. Don't underestimate the impact of this. I'll show you one place in particular. Let's take a look at impact on the workforce. Look at the age composition of the Wichita workforce here. If you take a look at this chart, the age bands 25 to 55 plus, there's a 40% growth of the population that's in the growth of the workforce that's age 55 plus. The single largest cohort is 55 plus. There are more, as we look at the end of the decade in 2020, there will be more workers in Wichita 55 plus than there are workers in the peak earning years between 35 and 54. This is a dramatic change. It's going to change workplaces. It's going to change the economy. So it's something to keep your eye on and start thinking about. As we look at this, one reason why it matters, and here we start to get some of the more technical stuff, but let's look at the impact on consumer spending. Peak earning years between 35 to 54 years old. Peak earning, peak spending years. It declines after that. Plummets after that. So the problem is, why does this matter? Number one, a smaller population in peak earnings and spending years will reshape aggregate consumer demand patterns. In other words, the age structure of Wichita means the economy will inherently slow down if there's no inflow, if there's no population growth. The economy slows simply because of the age structure. That's part of why growth matters. There are an increased number of organizations confronting generational leadership shifts. Say this in a couple ways. First off, in workplaces, there are a lot of workplaces around the country that are thinking about, that have the same kind of age structure, thinking about, how do we deal with this? It's our most expensive employees that are the bulk of our employees. We have fewer numbers underneath who are going to carry this on. How do we spread the knowledge? How do we retain the knowledge over time? Another place where the generational shifts matter is for some of our nonprofit clients. We're advising them that when they're so heavily dependent on a couple of foundations or family foundations, and we look at the leadership structure of those organizations, we can quickly identify, we can bet with certainty their leadership changes within the next 3 to 5 years. And the priorities of the givers underneath are different than the people running today. It'll have major impact on those raising money. Another reason why this age structure matters, accommodating the aging population will be one of the mounting challenges for America and for Wichita in a couple of respects. Number one, aging requires different patterns of mobility, different needs, different services. It is a fact that every municipality in America is going to have to deal with. Number two, if the aging population determines that it's time to retire elsewhere, and particularly the wealthy aging population that has the choice of whether or not to stay or move, if they determine there's a better place to do, that's a massive exodus of wealth from the community. So that's an issue. Number three is that we've actually seen this flip side of that. We've seen some communities grow dramatically because they've created a fantastic aging community. We've seen some churches that have built some fantastic infrastructure for seniors that has been a magnet for people to move, lots of people to move into that community, which is a fantastic source of growth. So the aging structure, the aging challenge is one of those issues to think heavily about when you think about the future of Wichita. Now, let's take a closer look at young adults. There's one strand I want to go to because we do a lot of economic demography, taking a look at demographics and income and mirroring that. And there's one fact I want to point out here, and that is the gender gap when you look at it through the lens of education. Back in 1972, which was the year of Title IX, men were 1.5 times more likely to earn bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees than college women were. Fast forward to 2014, women are 1.5 times more likely to earn bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees as men. A significant, profound shift. that's shaping a lot of things in the economy, a lot of things in the workforce. So let's take a look at Wichita specifically. A third of women aged 25 to 34 have bachelor's degrees versus 25% of men. So it's happening in Wichita as well, too. I hate to say it, the women are just clocking the men when it comes to educational attainment now. Okay, and I shouldn't have said I hate to say that. That's a fantastic thing. Fantastic thing for them, but you do have to wonder what is up with young men that can't keep up with the young women when it comes to educational attainment. So one of the questions we had was, so does this impact incomes? And this is what we found on that data set. We found that across America, there is a gender gap. Women working full-time earn 80% of men's income for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's not a political statement, and it's not a good or bad, but there are a lot of reasons that fuel that. Now, there is another gender gap. We were crunching census microdata, and we noticed this weird thing. The median income for single women in their 20s without kids is higher than it is for men. And it's not because a woman with the same job in education earns more than men. That's not true. What it means is, for a knowledge-based economy that's bringing in young talent, it's way more likely that the person filling that position is female versus male, because they're the ones with the degrees. So we took a look at that map across America. In almost every city, that's happening, except in Wichita. And we don't know the answer for this, because we haven't had a chance to look at it at a granular level, but there is something going on here. Is it because there's a lot of hiring of young men without college degrees in manufacturing? That could explain it. Or is it that it's not the environment that is attracting the audience that you want to come in with degrees? I don't know, but there's just something that we just wanted to flag about that. Now, let's take a look at a little deeper into income dynamics, what's happening. This is actually sort of a rough story across the country. When we look at incomes on an inflation-adjusted basis across age bands, over the last 7 years, it's dropping. The vast majority of households have less income today than they did on an inflation-adjusted basis than they did 7 years ago, 10 years ago, except for 65 plus, because some of the retirement funds are indexed, have COLA indexes, and also because they're working longer than they had in the past. It's also happening in Wichita, too. Basically, look at peak earnings years. Incomes in Sedgwick County down over that period. It's a national issue. It's happening here in Wichita. The only cities that are avoiding this are ones that are getting more good jobs in. Now, Wichita unemployment rate is recovering, but not back to the pre-recession peak. It's 6.5%, still has some ways to go. Compare that nationally. Oh, I guess I lost the slide from about nationally. The reason why I wanted to flag that slide is that, yeah, there it is. US unemployment is recovering. We actually didn't update the chart to 2014, but basically, we're back to where it was in the pre-recession peak. So the nation has recovered from the recession on most measures, at least by unemployment, not necessarily by incomes. But the nation has recovered when it comes to unemployment rate. In Wichita, it's not true. We have not recovered to the pre-recession peak. We're still in a recession here in Wichita. Now, let's take a look at, is unemployment really improving? This is another one of those things that starts getting the technical details, but we think is pretty important too. The blue line is the unemployment rate. The purple line is labor force participation. Our analysts have found that half the improvement in the employment rate in America is people checking out the workforce, saying, I'm checking out. That's half of the improvement. So we don't really have a full recovery yet. The reality is, also technically, the government reports the U3 unemployment rate, which is the people who are currently looking for a full-time job but not employed. The real unemployment rate that we track, because we find it to be such a better indicator of economic performance, and it helps us tell our clients when to expand, when to pull back, is the U6 unemployment rate. The U6 unemployment includes people who are checked out of the workforce, even though they'd like to have a job, but it's not even worth it, or people who are working part-time but want full-time jobs, underemployed. That rate's still 12.6%, still far above the pre-recession peak, so on that measure, the US economy has not recovered yet. Why does the U6 matter? We found that basically the U6 rate basically works in exact opposite with consumer household expenditures. Much better than the employment rate. This is why we use this. This is one of our most important predictive measures, the U6. And as we look at it, it's a remarkable measure to predict when something's going to be turning up or turning down. The U6 impact, even though the nation has recovered, theoretically, by the U3 unemployment rate, household spending shifts are still down. We've seen a recovery, but not in consumer spending. The U6 is the big holdup. Not everyone has recovered. And as we look in Kansas, the U6 is still pretty high. It's 11%. Kansas unemployment rate is typically way under national unemployment rate, and almost every year. It's still pretty much where the national is. It's still well above the pre-recession peak. Kansas and Wichita is still in a recession. Why does this matter? As pointed out, employment has not recovered like the rest of the US. The U3 rate has not come close to dropping as far as the national U3 rate has. Even with some improvement, aggregate consumer spending is still down. Until we get more jobs in, we're going to continue to see that stalling of consumer spending growth. The other thing I want to flag was that population shifts underway in Wichita because of the top-heavy age structure and a much smaller cohort in the peak earning years as we go through the rest of the decade. We're on a path for a further decrease in aggregate consumer spending. And in the US economy, where 70% of the economy is consumer spending, that means a recession, continued recession for Wichita, unless there is growth and bringing in more people in peak earnings years. Okay, so now let's take a look at regional productivity. Here's one of the things that we found a little concerning. Of the 281 metropolitan statistical areas in America, Wichita ranked 238 in terms of growth. In other words, it's one of the slowest growing economies. Now, there was a hit. There was Boeing that exited, and so there's some explanations for it. But for a long time, Wichita has never been in the top half. It just is not a fast-growing economy. Wichita is still below the peak year of gross regional product, even though the vast majority of metros in America have surpassed that already. Wichita is still in a recession. Where's the gap? Well, here's one of the things. We spend a lot of time on this, working on this issue in cities like Boston, LA, looking at this. And there's one key factor that we found that explains a good portion of productivity difference. That is cities with educational attainment. Once we see above 35% of households with college degrees, we call them high IQ cities, and they tend to correlate with growth pretty strongly. Wichita is not in that cluster. It's lower than some of the others. The ones that aren't on that list are typically ones that are growing a little bit less, or have different economic structures, but it's just not there. Now, here's probably the more challenging slide. Not just what's the educational attainment levels, because it makes sense. Wichita has an economy where you didn't have to have a college degree to succeed in the Wichita manufacturing environment. But here's the challenge that I have. Go on to the next slide. We looked at the percentage points of gain in college degrees since 1970. All of the markets that are absolutely on fire, like Austin, Texas, up 24 points. Raleigh, North Carolina, up 29 points. I should flag, at that point in time, Raleigh and Austin were about the same size as Wichita, not that far off. Wichita, there's been no growth in educational attainment over that period of time. That a lot explains why Wichita has the economic structure it does and what's holding it back from making that transition. Why it matters? The US economy has basically transitioned from a manufacturing-driven economy to an innovation-driven economy. Even the manufacturing entities that are surviving are innovation-driven. The challenge with that is that the productivity growth is tied heavily to educational attainment growth. Employers are looking for and requiring more and more out of their employment base, even in industries that don't require super high levels of degrees. Wichita's educational attainment growth has not been on par with metros that are growing. In part, it's reflective of the industry base here, but it's in part what is keeping some companies from saying, I'm going to Wichita versus somewhere else. Now, let's take a look at the Midwestern landscape specifically. We're very, very data-oriented. For us, it has nothing to do with politics. It's all about economics, and we just try to look at things through the lens of numbers. And one of the things that we did was, this was a piece of body of work that we updated that we did working with Steve Cohen at the Kansas Health Foundation, we mapped a bunch of cities across the Midwest against various economic indices. And some of the simpler ones that we include here: per capita GDP, GDP growth, unemployment rate, population change of young adults, bachelor's degrees. And when we look at 2001 versus 2013, here's where we are. Wichita was a little bit higher in 2001. It's dropped to the bottom of that comp set in 2013. But look at how extreme the change is. Wichita has basically been flat in terms of per capita GDP. That is, calculate the economic production of a region divided by the number of people who live there. Wichita is flat. Look at the jumps for those other cities. Oklahoma City makes sense. That's energy. Look at the jump in Cedar Rapids. Look at where Des Moines sits. There's a significant difference. We looked at per capita GDP growth over that period of time, and what we see is Wichita had basically no per capita GDP growth. It's not producing more than it did in 2001 on a per capita basis, versus look at some of those other cities, 12%, 17%, 35%. Unemployment rate, the Midwest typically has lower levels of employment. Wichita has the highest of that comp set. Let's take a look at population change of younger adults entering their peak earnings years. Wichita, on the lower end, of bringing younger adults in. Back to bachelor's degrees, once again, these are cities with effectively the same economies, but have figured out how to do a little bit more with that. So we've got a little bit of a challenge. Now, this is a little bit of an unfair slide because we put it against comps that we picked for a reason. And let's take a look at what's happening in some of those cities. Oklahoma City. Basically, Oklahoma City had a big oil bust in the 80s, and they were a laggard through most of the 90s. They were has-been. They had among the nation's strongest employment growth and income growth this decade. After sort of the collapse of the 1990s, civic leaders really started to put their heads together to figure out what is Oklahoma City, what makes it special, what can we do? And they started to undertake a lot of measures to start addressing those issues. In part, the gain is energy-driven. In part, some big wins with major employers. You know that story. They tell me that they actually had much lower incentives put on the table than all the other bidders bidding for these kinds of, for their employer gains. Instead, what they're selling, and this is a quote they gave me, they're focusing investment on creating a better place where people want to live. They were saying that when they're talking about why they have no problem going head-to-head against Wichita for work, for companies. As a matter of fact, when we were calling these cities that had performance at higher levels. And I was talking to the woman who was running economic development at the time. Every single time I connected with her, where was she? She was on her cell phone driving to Kansas. The mayor had told me that if Wichita does not understand that Boeing is a wake-up call, that's a major, major issue. They do a very good job at what they do. Then they've had some fantastic performance after that. Now let's take a look at some cities that were not energy-driven. Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha, Nebraska is a very interesting situation. It's about 40% the size of Kansas City, but the same number of Fortune 1000 companies. Unemployment rate 1/3 lower. This Omaha, Nebraska, you wouldn't have thought, or at least wouldn't have thought, had one of the nation's highest population growth of people with college degrees over the last decade. It's become a really hot city for that. I know folks, friends who are like, former McKinsey consultants who married a New York fashion editor who moved to Omaha and loves it. They've been a magnet for a well-educated young adult population. Dramatic expansion of downtown and civic investment continues. When I spoke with the leaders there, they emphasized that there's a dramatic level of cooperation between business, government, nonprofits, and donors. They do have a little bit of an advantage which makes them an outlier. It's not one individual necessarily, but the diaspora of a lot of people who made money parking their excess assets in Berkshire Hathaway. And as the folks in Omaha said, they said that there's such a strong culture we've created here where they say, if you have made money in Omaha, you are going to be sitting at the table and you are going to be helping us figure out where we go, and you're going to be opening up your checkbook to help make it happen. Someone in Omaha told me, it was talking to their city leaders, they said, no good idea goes unfunded because we're going to find someone. If it's a good idea, we're going to find someone, and people are expected to do that if they made money in Omaha. So there's a culture of that. There's a culture of giving back to the community that they have. Let's take a look at another example, Des Moines, Iowa. Des Moines, Iowa, smaller than Wichita, but it has far more professional and scientific jobs than Wichita does. They've been fantastic at it. The Des Moines, Iowa economy was a total laggard through much of the mid-century of the last decade. And starting in about 1990, about the same time as Oklahoma City, they decided to get serious about that and figure out what can they do. And today, unemployment is a third lower than Wichita. 35% of adults have a college degree versus 28% in Wichita. Their household income is 18% higher than Wichita. I think that's one of the best measures. Their households are in better shape. They had almost twice the population growth and almost twice the household income growth versus Wichita over the last decade. They're the nation's one metro for median income versus cost of living. I think Good Morning America today called them the wealthiest city in America. This is one of the things that sort of stunned me. 70% of management jobs held by women. Now, when I first talked to them, they did not really know this figure. And this was not part of their strategy that they undertook to get the community together. But it's something that's in their culture that helps fuel their reputation as a great place to raise a family. You can work or not work, you can live in the city, you can live in the suburbs, out in the country, you know you're going to get a good school, and you can live your family's life the way you want to live. And they built up a strong reputation for that. I didn't know how far their reputation spread. Des Moines has figured out what their asset base is. Des Moines, they know it's not going to be Austin, it's not going to be Raleigh. They figured out at the heart of who they are and how to package that well. I didn't realize how far the reputation spread till because we do some of our work in a category called healthy living. We were meeting with the management team of one of the huge athletic footwear brands. You'd recognize the brand name. We're meeting with the women's division. And we were talking about a lot of different topics, including what's happening with how are all these shifts playing out in different arenas. Then we started talking about cities. And then I started talking about what happened. Then I talked about, and here's an example of a city where we saw all these things starting to come together. Women's educational attainment, blah, 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 women in the workforce, incomes up, population up. And a woman in the room said, "Is that someplace like Des Moines?" And I said, "How would you know?" And she said, "Well, because almost all of my friends after college took off for Chicago, DC, Boston, and almost all those friends are going back to Des Moines because they're all saying it's a remarkable place to raise the family and have the career I want to have and have time with my family and have a great life." And there was a woman sitting next to her who's obviously a big city manager type who said, "Iowa, I never would have thought about that, but gee, it sounds like maybe I should think of going there." And then the SVP of that division was saying, "If we weren't strapped to this company, that's where we should run our business." And has anyone said that about Wichita? Not yet. But think about what is it that makes Wichita special and what is it that you have to sell. Des Moines has done a great job of that. My favorite quote out of Des Moines is, there are a lot of people who say, they're all over the country, they're all over the world, winning business. They've got, billion-dollar data center operations from Google and Facebook. I mean, they're just win after win after win. And what the phrase I hear from them, that I've been hearing from them lately is, I hear them saying, when we're going after economic development, we fight above our weight. Pretty good attitude to go in with. Let's take a look at another city, Cedar Rapids, similar size to Topeka. This was a city in absolute collapse. Manufacturing and agricultural processing was just tanking in the mid-'80s. Around the same point in time, they decided they needed to do something about that. Their leading employers were all increasingly based elsewhere. There were no big companies who were headquartered in Cedar Rapids anymore. But today, they stay and they grow in Cedar Rapids. They had the Midwest's highest rate of job growth and GDP growth in the 2000s. This small city, 200,000, has $750 million of projects financed or under construction right now. What they do is they visit the headquarters of every major employer every 18 months, and they ask. At first, they were told, you're too expensive. Now what they're told is, you're our most productive, you are our most expensive city to manufacture in, but you are the most productive. I don't know if you recall a couple slides back, the GDP growth out of Cedar Rapids was something like 30% over the last decade. What they've done was that they had this community college there, and they've developed this remarkable regional approach to leverage surrounding higher educational infrastructure for continual technological and innovation workforce improvements and training. This is a city of 200,000 where the enrollment at that community college is 66,000. It's just in their culture. I asked them, and they said there's 40,000 unique individuals. Some of them double registered on things, but there's just this culture of continuing to sharpen the saw that drives dramatic performance growth for their employers. And how is this funded? It's sort of this neat little cycle here that basically the community college pays for a lot of the research to figure out where they continue to reinvent to stay in alignment where the companies are reinventing in the future and where employment gaps are going to happen in the future. How do they fund it? Well, it's because they have this community that's just pouring money, paying for all this community development and training for the employees. It's basically, they're just doing it because they've made an economic model that is just this self-supporting cycle. It's a remarkable thing that's happened there. But the reason why I flagged this is, as we've been spending more and more time in and around this issue, we've realized that, especially in a Midwestern city, I mean, we do a lot of this kind of stuff in major metros. DC, let's see, last week I was in LA doing it, next week in DC, we do this, but it's in the mid-sized cities where you actually can turn the knobs, move the needle. Omaha, Des Moines, Oklahoma City, Cedar Rapids did. They all had different formulas for doing it, but they found the formula that worked for their community, and they made it happen, and it was evident in most of the economic indicators. It paid off. It's been great for them. Now, let's take a look at Wichita. We're now at a point in time where it's really an inflection point. It's an inflection point of stagnation or innovation. That's just where we are with the economy at this point in time. The manufacturing economy has changed for good. It's not going to change. The manufacturing that's left tends to be very innovation-driven, and a lot of the new industries that are growing are innovation-driven, and we have to think about where does Wichita want to be. Now, on one hand, sometimes we're a little bit concerned about this because it's like, well, what can Wichita do? In some ways, you think about it, the back is up against the wall. It's a pretty challenging situation that Wichita is in right now. But we decided to take a look at what can we learn about the future of Wichita by looking back at the history of Wichita. So let's take a look at 1870. Wichita's incorporated, and there are four guys who took it upon themselves, the four horsemen, who decided that they were going to become commercial real estate developers in this new city. And to fuel the business, they were going to go intercept cattle drives, because it was a long way from Oklahoma City to the trailheads in Kansas City or Abilene. And they were going to intercept cattle drives to bring people to Wichita. And that's how they got Wichita kick-started. Now, are old business models ones that you necessarily want to replicate? Well, I don't know, because those businesses were like, gambling saloons and brothels. But, it was basically a couple people took it upon themselves to decide we're going to make Wichita. If that hadn't happened, Wichita would probably look like Arkansas City or Hutchinson. By the way, my wife still thinks I'm kidding when I say it's the Arkansas River. Okay, so let's fast forward 49 years. 49 years later, two oilmen in El Dorado decide we're going to take our wealth made in oil and recruit an aviation company, Matty Laird, to build planes in Wichita. Falling out of Laird there were guys working for Laird by the name of Lloyd Stearman, Cessna, Beach. Boy, this will probably go down as one of the best venture capital bets in history when those guys poured their oil money into doing that in terms of impact for a community. So that was a trajectory from 49 years, Wichita had a chance to reinvent itself. Then what happened 47 years later? Pizza Hut starts franchising across the country. And that business model ended up being the same kind of platform that other companies could use to build these brands in Wichita and franchise across the country. So not only was the impact of that, out of Pizza Hut, became a culture where it was easier to launch a Residence Inn or a Rent-A-Center, let's not underestimate the value of cultivating companies like that because they attract talent into Wichita. If it weren't for Pizza Hut, hiring young architects to do redesign of red roofs, Patrick Degas probably wouldn't have moved to Wichita. Kent Williams probably wouldn't have returned to Wichita to found Fish House. There's a reason you want these kinds of companies in here. So 49 years before the next, that next innovation, 47 years. So we're looking at roughly about a 48-year cycle. 48 years, where does that take us? 2014. So we're at a point in time now where you can sit here and say, that was a really cool story. Or you can say, it's time. It's time to figure out what is the innovation that works for Wichita. It's time to go make that happen. It's time to figure out, who are the four horsemen? Who are the oil men who are going to step up to the table? Who are the people that we're going to bring into Wichita to be able to figure out where Wichita happens? You can sit here and say, well, let's see if it happens, or you can decide to be part of that process. And so I encourage you all to be part of the discussion. Think hard, because one of the things that we've seen in these mid-sized markets is it is remarkable what a motivated group of people can do to make a huge difference in the community. Thanks.
Thank you, James. What we're going to do now is actually transition to you. And so Jason's in the back, and so is Jamie. If y'all could raise your hands so that people could see you. If you could, just raise your hands in the section that you're in, and they'll get to you. We'd like to use the mic so that other people in the room can actually hear the question, and also so James could hear the question in its detail as well. So we'll start the questioning time now. Questions? You got the mic here. Any questions?
There's one over here.
In Kansas, one of the things we hear most about with economic development, if you get taxes low enough and government small enough, you're going to have great growth. And I didn't hear anything about that in your demographics and education and percentages. I'd like to hear a little bit of your take on that, okay. James.
Let me start off by saying, once again, for us, we're a very apolitical organization. It's not about the politics. We just look at things through a data perspective and looking at that. So we've had the chance to look at this for our clients in various respects, given that taxes are always an issue, always going to be. Let me just explain a little bit about the process of how we're wired. What we do is, at the core of our work, we build hypotheses. And then we try to figure out how can we build data sets to prove or disprove hypotheses. So for example, one null hypothesis would be lower taxes drive economic growth. And another null hypothesis might be smart deployment of taxes drive economic growth. And here's what we found. So we try to figure out, can we build data sets to build better indication of the role of taxes in economic growth? And the problem is that there is absolutely no evidence in the world that proves either of those scenarios. You can cherry pick and pull one example and use it to support your case. but there is no cohesive set of data that absolutely proves for sure that one or the other is the only thing that matters. Taxes are one of many factors that determine whether companies move in or out, whether people move in or out. It's one of them. So I'll just give you some examples. Like if you take the 10 fastest growing states of the last 3 years, 10 years, most time periods, what do you find? Well, when we looked at that, 5 are among the lower tax states in the country, 5 are among the highest tax states in the country, among the 10 fastest growing states. Taxes are one of the factors. It's not the deciding factor. We also look at it from the perspective of, like, when we're figuring out economic development scenarios for community planning, what we're seeing is we look at things like why do companies move and why do people move. We do a lot of work in LA, which is getting decimated. LA actually calls itself the aerospace capital of the world. They're losing job numbers big time. Why are companies moving their operations elsewhere? Why are companies staying? We look at that question a lot because it has a huge impact on our private sector clients that are trying to get arms around these issues. And what we find among the employees who move, of the employees who move from, let's say, California to Texas, which is a very common move pattern, when we look at their tax burden, for the majority of the employees, the tax burden is the same. Taxes are much lower in Texas for the very high income, but they're actually equal to California for middle income. So taxes are not really an issue except for the executives, but for most of the workforce who has to make a decision, do I move with my company or not, taxes are equal. So it's not that big of an issue. Their issue is cost of living and quality of living. That's why people decide, do I love LA enough to put up with it, or do I say, screw it, I'm going to go someplace where I can live a better life? That's why employees move. In terms of why the companies move, because we have to look at that. We have to like project, is an economy going to grow or shrink? Are companies going to stay or leave? In our analysis of that, what we're seeing is that taxes are one factor, but there are factors that are also equal or typically greater. Things like economic incentive packages, or the biggest one of all, access to labor talent. That's what it comes down to. That's the biggest factor. So to answer your question, I wish I could tell you 100% sure that taxes are everything or that taxes don't matter. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. All right. Steve. Okay.
We heard from two speakers now. The bachelor's degrees are really important. Have you seen any innovative models to increase the number of bachelor's degrees? And also in another presentation, I remember you saying that we have a really high rate of engineers.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, okay, so Steve asked two good questions. One is about increasing educational attainment and bachelor's degrees, and number two is about, I'll leave that one for the end, and I'll answer that one. Okay, let me give two examples from the Midwest about increasing levels of educational attainment. One of them I've already given. Cedar Rapids is not seeing a dramatic increase in bachelor's degrees, yet bachelor's degrees are not the only piece of educational attainment that matters. Cedar Rapids is an education machine, even for the high school graduate, the people who've only graduated high school degrees. They're making that community smarter year by year. Productivity is jumping year by year, and employees are investing more year by year, whether or not it's the college-educated crowd or not. If I had to guess, Cedar Rapids is probably one of the most productive manufacturing cities in America. That's why their results are going so well, and it is about educational attainment. Another example about increasing educational attainment, the state that's probably done the best job of that is the state of North Dakota. Now, granted, they have some energy windfall, but they're investing it in interesting ways. What's happened in North Dakota is North Dakota has a situation where they're seeing a depopulation of young adults. Young adults have been, for decades, have been depopulating North Dakota. Their student population was shrinking. If you think about that analytically, what's the obvious response? Cut the spending of the higher educational system. Since everyone's leaving anyway, it's getting smaller. Why not right-size it? North Dakota made a very different bet, though. North Dakota decided to say, you know what? if we're going to grow, we have to find a way to retain and increase the number of educated young adults. Otherwise, all the experts we rely on are going to be people flying in from Chicago and Minneapolis. So what they did was they made the North Dakota schools some of the most friendly for out-of-state students possible. The tuitions are great there. The level of education is great. I mean, I never thought, my wife, who is a very East Coast kind of person, got a call one day from the law school in North Dakota system, and she said, no thanks. And they called her back and said, you really need to look at this. She went out there, she fell in love with North Dakota. They are investing heavy in education. I never would have expected this, the last thing I would have expected from her. And she was torn, because it was a remarkable, they are investing so heavily in education, they're trying to make it attractive to bring people in North Dakota, and they've got the stated objective, we want people to stay we want them to come here, we want to put our hooks in them, get them exposed to the employers, and get them to stay for at least a couple years. Because if we can do that, we can get a lot of them to stay for a lot longer than that. And what's happened since then? They're not just bringing in the undereducated males who work on the drilling rigs. They're bringing in a huge class of well-educated young adults. They've just invested in the system, invested in the students coming, and now the professional base are not all the people flying in and out of the prop jets. They're people who live and work in the community. They've done a fantastic job at jumping up their level of educational attainment, despite the fact that they had smaller populations of young children and that they had a track record of losing more of the young adults. So they've done a great job at that. Once again, is that the answer? No, but there are ways that you can address this. Now, Steve's other question was about a chart that we had presented to the Kansas Health Foundation where we were doing some analysis and we found this really peculiar thing. When we looked at the percentage there's so much discussion about the value of the STEM workforce, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. We were able to index the percentage of the number of students pursuing graduate degrees in the STEM disciplines compared to the percentage of the workforce. And the number one state was probably an obvious one. What would you guess the number one state is that has the highest percentage of students doing graduate degrees in STEM disciplines? No, not California. Massachusetts. Yep, exactly. I should have said obvious. I should have said it's everyone's second guess, but everyone will come up with a second guess. It's Massachusetts. Number one state in terms of highest percentage of students pursuing graduate degrees in STEM disciplines. What's state number two? Kansas. Kansas is doing a fantastic job at providing good educations, getting them through the hardest disciplines in college, getting them on to graduate degrees in the STEM disciplines, and building institutions that attract people from out of state and out of the country to study, to do advanced study and training in STEM disciplines. But what happens to them? They leave. So one of the biggest exports of Kansas is well-educated talent. At least in Massachusetts, in industry, and they make a lot of money off of it. But this is, we're basically funding a system to train these people to go leave. There's something wrong with that mismatch because there's something good happening here educationally, but Kansas is not reaping the rewards of that when it could be. So that's one of the puzzles that we came across, one of the challenges, but also one of the opportunities because there's some fantastic educational institutions here between Wichita State, K-State, KU, among others. It's a great place. But something's not clicking, something's not optimized. It's an opportunity. Other questions? Yes, there's one back here.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with what's going on at Wichita State University now with the Innovative Technology Transfer Campus. I'm wondering, while not unique in this country, if that's the kind of program, if successful over the next 10 to 20 years, is the kind of jump starter that you've been talking about, or were you looking for something different or maybe better than that?
I wasn't aware of that until I started speaking with Lou Heldman about it, and he sent me the plans, and I was just jumping for joy as soon as I got that email. Because I've seen the power of what happens when you combine an educational institution that can put its resources in alignment with the community it serves and the employment needs of that community. So what I'm hoping for is that there's a strong dialogue, strong relationship between Wichita State, that leadership and the vision they have there is fantastic. I mean, it sounds like Wichita State has the right president for the time that Wichita needs right now. I'm hoping that Wichita State can continue that dialogue with all of the entities across Wichita, with the leading employers across Wichita to continue to tune that, to do what Kirkwood Community College did for Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I mean, there's no question. That relationship, the tight, and by the way, when I was speaking with folks over at Kirkwood Community College, I mean, their integration with the economic development process is phenomenal. I hope that happens here because the results were fantastic there. And I hope that that those entities really tune this to be another one of those models to deliver, as is proven in Cedar Rapids. So I'm optimistic. That's exactly what I was hoping to see happen. It's not going to be an easy path, but I'm certainly hoping that everyone supports what they're doing and that there's strong communication planning to be able to leverage that resource in a phenomenal way here. All right, thanks for the question there, then we can come back here.
Hey, I'm Brian Black with Spirit Aero Systems, one of the aircraft manufacturers in town. Could you talk a little bit, and I've heard you mentioned it in some of your comments, the importance of the integration of the whole education system. One of the challenges I find here, I've lived in many states, and we have operations in many states. We've got great four-year institutions, community colleges doing things, et cetera, but what I see in Kansas, the integration doesn't happen. How do we create a system of education from K-12 all through the system? Because for my company, I mean, I need the technically trained folks to work on the shop floor to those PhDs you just talked about. But can you kind of talk about what you've seen in different models in other states where we have facilities? That is one of the reasons why we're there, because of the integration from kindergarten all the way to a PhD. It's a real integrated system. Can you kind of talk about models you've seen and how that becomes part of the economic engine?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question about this integration of the system, the educational system in particular. One of the things that we learned about this process in talking to all of the cities that were outperformers, or almost all of them, one of the things that they emphasized most was there was an incredible level of collaboration in their cities. They had come from other cities, and they ended up, what they see in those cities that are just absolutely nailing it, they said that the difference was there is incredible coordination, incredible integration between the various entities in planning for the future. So, for example, in Des Moines, they say, look, the CEOs are at the table with their time, with their money, and with their relationships, and they are working with all of the different parties to figure out how to get it in alignment as well as possible. We heard that in Omaha. They emphasized there is a culture we've created here where everyone has to play, everyone has to pay, if they've made money in that town. And they bring the parties together. The CEOs are all together, the CEOs are all participating, and there's just an ethos of we bring these systems together. And that's one of the common themes that they were just pounding when I was interviewing on these calls. They're having grown up in Wichita and spent a little of my career here, my impression had always been when I was growing up, it maybe wasn't that integrated in the past. That basically there were different entities that operated independently. There was nothing sort of systematic, doing regarding that. And since that point in time, I've had the chance to come back to Wichita maybe every 2 years or so. I have to say, this trip back today gave me a very different feeling. In leading up to this, it's the first time I felt like, wow, this feels like a different city now. There's much greater level of discussion, dialogue, thinking. It just feels different. It feels like it's a different time that made me very optimistic because it just seems like some of that integration is happening at a greater level than I had sensed before. And I do this across lots of cities, so I'm sort of like, I sort of look for that stuff. And it just feels like it's come together, but I can't emphasize enough your point. You say you see this in other cities, and that's why you're in those cities. I think you're right. I mean, well, you're the ultimate voter of that in deciding, you're the one who brings the jobs. You're the decision maker. You're the one who values it. I think Wichita has to make sure that happens. And I think it's because there's no question about it. That's what the employers notice, because when you get it right, the output and the outcomes show. So I'm glad you flagged that in front of this audience, because that's pretty important. Yes.
I think I have the mic. Okay. So we've talked about education, we've talked about talent retention, but when your discussion about Californians moving to Texas, you said cost of living and quality of life. Mm-hmm. So obviously, most people would tell you that cost of living here is, you can't beat it.
Yeah.
But with all that money that you save, what are the entertainment, the culture, the infrastructure that goes into retaining that talent and quality of life? And I've also been hearing lots on NPR about downtown development and also transportation, which I know a lot of discussion has been happening. So
yeah, that's a good question about quality of life, and the challenge is that in part, quality of life is defined differently by different segments and types of households, and so what we find is that there are different ways to do that. So let's take, for example, Des Moines. We don't see Des Moines as an outperformer in attracting, it's not the hot town for young adults like Omaha is. Omaha's built up a fantastic infrastructure around that. I mean, they've expanded the opportunities, so people like Connor Oberst pops out of Omaha. So they've been able to make real big physical headway where Omaha has really popped as a magnet for educated young adults. Let's take Des Moines. Des Moines has not had the same kind of capital pouring in that Omaha has to have been able to enable that. But Des Moines defines quality of life very differently. Des Moines is all about come here and we guarantee you are going to be able to have every kind of a career you could have had in any other city in America, and your life with your family is going to be way better. So they're defining quality of life a little bit differently. So they're focused on how do we build these assets that create better lives for these families coming in, to the point where people recognize it's not just what people say, but it's visibly better than all the other alternatives that organizations or that the employers or employees are looking for. So that's one of the things to think about is, this is why it goes back to building a system and a systematic approach, because you have to start thinking about what are the asset bases already in place that would be attractive to employers? What are the asset bases already in place that would be attractive to employees? What are the areas that you can grow? What kind of employment needs might they have? Therefore, what kind of recruiting needs might they have? And what kind of infrastructure do you need in place for that? That's why it really is important to think about this systematically. It's not one answer. It's not like there's this perfect, the model to follow and you win. There have been a lot of cities who've wasted a lot of money following the hot model, and nothing happened with it. It's figuring out what fits Wichita's asset, what makes it special. How do you amplify that? How does that fit with the kind of employers that they like your employees, and those employees will like the city, and figure just how to magnify that. So unfortunately, I can't tell you it's got to be building this, or that this has been the answer for every city. Every city wants to build the museum like the Bilbao Guggenheim, and see the art, see visitation skyrocket. It's not that simple, and unfortunately, there are a lot of people who will tell you it is. I certainly know from growing up here, there's a lot that's special about Wichita. I just don't think Wichita has packaged it very well. And I don't think Wichita has started to leverage what it has to grow it significantly, better, bigger and better and greater than it has in the past. Yes?
I haven't heard you mention Nashville at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just got back from a week there. I traveled extensively. It's probably one of the hottest cities
Yes.
I've been to in a long time.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Nashville, we have not worked in the Nashville market yet, but we're actually about to be brought in by a private equity fund investing heavily in Nashville, so I'll be able to tell you a lot more about Nashville in 6 months.
Probably a dozen high-rises under construction.
Yeah.
Residential high-rises
No, Nashville, without question, is a hot city right now. It's a magnet for young adults, which is why you see a lot of high-rise construction right now. But I think this is we do have they do have the advantage of some assets they've learned how to amplify to attract young adults. And they've had solid job growth. I suspect if we looked at it, educational attainment growth is pretty strong there, because we found that's been a highly correlating factor and sometimes a causal factor for that kind of growth. Yeah, but there are a lot of cities like that. I mean, once again, you've heard it before. The hottest growth cities in America, like the Raleighs, like the Austins, they used to be Wichita size. And by the way, I'll be happy to stick around afterwards for anyone who has other questions. Yes.
Do you believe that some negative stereotypes that have been perpetuated either fairly or unfairly through media nationally regarding the Heartland or Wichita specifically has contributed to young people either not coming here or leaving to find other venues that they feel are more accepting or more modern, et cetera?
It's a really good question. And we tackle this issue big time in other categories, but I can relate that to sort of observations of Wichita. We spend a lot of time thinking about what shifts consumer sentiment and attitudes about things. When I was growing up, when you think about sort of the brand of Wichita, when I was growing up, when you left Wichita, outsiders' perception of the brand of Wichita was Cowtown or Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is what I always heard. If I were an economic development leader in Wichita and that were the brand impression of Wichita, I can win that battle. I can win that one. But when you think about the brand reputation of Wichita today, there's not one answer, but there's a cluster of stuff out there, regardless of where you are politically, socially, so forth. It's almost as if Kansas has become the whipping post in a lot of things, especially in the era of the internet, where it's what we call sort of the assortive economy. People are getting all of their information from very specific sources, and it feeds at each other at a much higher rate. And so the general impression, the brand impression of Wichita is more and more defined by negative stereotypes ever than before, of all kinds. The problem is, well, first off, I know Wichita isn't like what people think. Like when people ask me, God, when people get to know me and they see what I've done in earlier years, they said, wow, God, you've done some really, really, really cool stuff, remarkable things when you were younger, but how'd you do that growing up in Wichita? And I tell them, wait, hold on a second. I didn't do it in spite of growing in Wichita. I did it because I grew up in Wichita. I know that there's a lot more to Wichita than sort of that negative stereotype that's out there. The problem is Wichita is not putting out a counter-narrative to explain why are we better than that. And that's what I would push you to do. Think about that. What is that counter-narrative where when someone says the city's name, you get that kind of response that someone got about Des Moines? Des Moines isn't. It's cool what the performance numbers are cool, but it's not a cooler city than Wichita. It's Des Moines. My apologies to anyone in Des Moines who might hear that comment. They've figured out the counter narrative to sell Des Moines. It's time for Wichita to put out the counter narrative to sell Wichita. Now, just final things to think about this. I know this is the last question. I'm happy to stick around for anyone who has questions afterwards. Happy to do that. The challenge with the stuff that I'm saying is it's not easy. We're in a challenging environment, externally, economically, internally. There are lots of reasons, there are lots of things that would make it easy to say it's just too hard to make this difference. It's too hard to make this change. But we really are at that inflection point. You can decide whether that 48-year cycle is true or not, but it's up to the people in this room, and it's up to the people in the community to decide that. It's not others outside who are going to decide that for you. It's you guys. But it's not easy. And, The only thing I can think of, probably when a friend of mine in Florida saw the article in the Eagle posted, they emailed me and they said, oh, it was fun to read the article, to think back to the times that we remember back in Wichita. And then she had a reference to one thing that just really put a smile on my face, which I think couldn't be more relevant now. It's really hard, but this is the time to dig deep. It's MTXE, baby. All right, thanks.
James, thank you so much for the words that you gave us. You know, some of the things is that this is a defining moment. We must be strategic. We must be tenacious. We need to create a culture of success. We need to create a culture of giving back. We need to drive our education, integrate that education with business, and most importantly, we need to be increasing the stickiness of our college educated to stay here in our great state, but also our great city. James, thank you for being here. We want to thank our sponsors for making tonight possible, the Leadership Council, the Chamber of Commerce, the Knight Foundation, the Community Foundation, our Downtown Development Corporation, the Lux, Dr. Eister, Michael Ramsey, Far Hall Construction, and Ken Audiovisual. We have one more in this lecture series, so mark your calendar if you haven't already. It's October the 29th. Brad Segal from Progressive Urban Management Associates out of Denver will be coming to present the top 10 urban trends, the global trends. This report and Brad's work just won an international award within the last couple of weeks. So we're very fortunate to have Brad here as well. But a tremendous lineup with Carol, James, and Brad coming in. Let's give James one more round of applause. Thank you again. We'll see you here on the 29th. It will be a different setup. So if you think you've seen it, you haven't. It will actually be on a different floor, if that intrigues you a little bit. It'll start at 5 o'clock. And again, thank you for being here tonight.